Lesson 3, Configuring ESXi Host Access and Authentication. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to meet the following objectives. Configure the ESXi firewall by enabling and disabling services, enable and disable lockdown mode on an ESXi host, and configure any user logins to authenticate with your directory services, such as Active Directory. Here we're going to discuss a little bit about your host system profiles. And any host that is managed by a connected vCenter server system is configured in this way that you see here in this whole chart right here. So basically, you are able to configure ESXi host settings for the virtual machine on the host, and then the host system itself and its resources, along with the hardware of the host itself. The configuration is separated by host settings, network configuration, storage, and other categories that exist here within the setup. When configuring your security profile services, you start and stop the security profile services to control when they're running on your vCenter server system. And you also control whether or not the services start and stop with the host or must be started manually. So right here you'll notice it shows the name and status of the daemon that is stopped and running. It shows your name here and your service details here and shows the status of it here. Your ESXi firewalls, they control access to your devices in the perimeter by closing all the communication pathways, except for the pathways that the administrator allows or doesn't allow as being authorized or unauthorized. So these pathways or ports that administrators open in the firewall, they enable the traffic between the devices on different sides of the firewall. And with the ESXi firewall engine, the rule sets define port rules for each service. And for the remote host, you can specify the IP address or the range of IP addresses that are allowed across each service. And your firewall management, your firewall management is configured at the command line of your ESXi CLI network firewall namespace. So it's something similar to your Power CLI. When enabling and disabling lockdown mode, the lockdown mode forces all of the operations to be performed through your vCenter server. And when the host is in lockdown mode, you cannot run any commands from your VMware vSphere command line interface or your VMware vSphere CLI interface or CLI or command line interface from an administrator server or from a script. Your external software or management tools might not be able to retrieve or modify any information from the ESXi host either. And with that being said, the root user, as you see here in this CLI right here, command line interface, is still authorized to log in the direct console or the DCUI when lockdown mode is enabled. As you see in here in this slide, to increase the security of your ESXi host, you could put your host in this lockdown mode, but when you enable lockdown mode, no users other than the VPX user have authentication permissions, and the users cannot perform any operations against the host directly. And as you'll see here, when you perform your lockdown mode, you got this check. Right here is where you'd want to check it to ensure that you enable lockdown mode. So here's something new in vSphere 6 also. You got the strict lockdown mode. And in normal lockdown mode, the ESXi host can be accessed through your vCenter server. And the only users who are on the exception list and have your admin privileges can log in to the DCUI itself. And if SSH or your vSphere ESXi shell are enabled, access might be possible through these also. But in strict lockdown mode, the ESXi host cannot be accessed but only through the vCenter server. And if SSH or your vSphere ESXi shell are enabled, These running sessions for accounts are in the DCUI. Your Access Advanced options that have administrator privileges remain enabled. The sessions for the exception list users with your administrator privileges also remain enabled. The exception list now, this keeps the exception list users basically, they keep their permissions when the ESXi host enters lockdown mode. And these accounts are meant to be used by third-party solutions or your external applications that basically need ESXi to continue functioning. And only users associated with these applications should be added to the exception list, meaning if they have no association to use the ESXi host, I would not add them to the exception list going forward to keep them or to prevent them from using those services or your environment. When integrating your ESXi with your Active Directory, the day-to-day vSphere management operations are usually done through the VMware or your vSphere web client while logged into the vCenter server. And with that being said, the user sometimes requires direct access to the ESXi host. And your vCenter server single sign-on is the recommended way to manage user access to those hosts. The Active Directory, or basically your Active Directory or your AD domain to which the users belong, is added to the vCenter single sign-on as the identity source. And with that being said, you can still have your local users defined and managed host by host and configured by the vSphere web client also. You can use this approach in place of your vCenter single sign-on and your Active Directory integration. Now, whenever you're asked to provide the credentials, you can enter either the username and password of a user in the domain to which the host is joined. And the advantage of this is that you can continue to manage user accounts by using your Active Directory. And this model is basically easier to manage and less stress on your IT infrastructure and more secure than trying to manage the accounts independently by host. So being able to do this by your Active Directory environment, you can basically manage all your accounts throughout all of your hosts in your environment. The only user that is defined by default on the system is the root user also. And the initial root password is set when you install your ESXi installation, which we hit on that in ICM6, which was install, configure, manage. And one thing to know is you can change that later by using the vSphere web client or the DCUI, but most of the time you want to leave it as you set it up, just easier to manage in my opinion. Now, I will note that root, well, let me take this back. The root user is the only user that is defined on the ESXi host. The root password is not mapped to an Active Directory account, meaning that when you set up your ESXi host, it has no affiliation with your Active Directory. If the host is integrated with Active Directory, then those local roles, they can also be granted to the Active Directory users and groups. So basically an example of this is you have your AD group, which can be created to include users who should have administrative rights on a subset of the ESXi host. And on those hosts, the administrator role can be granted to that AD group. For any other users that you may have, those users would not have the administrator role because you didn't assign them to that specific AD group. Now, the ESXi host subset grants your administrative access to the AD group named your ESX admins, which allows the creation of your global administrators group. And these built-in roles on the ESXi host are administrator, read-only, and no access. So just know that although you can create custom roles, you have to create them separately on each ESXi host, and creating custom roles in the VMware vCenter server is preferred and basically VMware says that's probably best practice is to create those custom roles within your VMware vCenter server. Now you should be able to meet the following objectives. You should be able to configure the ESXi firewall by enabling and disabling services, enable and disable lockdown mode on an ESXi host, and configure user logins to authenticate with Active Directory services.